The COVID-19 outbreak and the resulting disruption have caused a dramatic change in the way the legal industry functions. It's a fact that although change can be good, it also brings with it certain challenges. To look at the topic from the legal lens, now we bring you a fireside chat with eminent speakers, Kapil Sibal, Member of Parliament, and T.K. Arun, Consulting Editor, The Economic Times, to lead the conversation.
Well, thank you very much. It's really a delight to be with you all on a topic of great interest, I think, to the business community, to government, to members of parliament, to the people of India, in the context of COVID-19. And the topic, of course, is reimagining policy and law in the new normal. Now, the fact of the matter is that COVID has, in a sense, paralyzed all activity. Ever since the lockdown happened on March 24, the evening of March 24, when the Prime Minister announced the lockdown, there have been ad hoc decisions what to do, what not to do. And unfortunately, Parliament has not been in session. The executive authorities have not had a chance, perhaps, in the context of the lockdown, to really reach out to people and find out what the problems are on the ground. The judiciary, too, had shut shop for many months, did not function for many months. So in this situation, we must reimagine what we should have done or what we should do in the event there's another disaster of this nature at a national level. And I think that the voices of democracy, the first point I wish to make is that the voices of democracy cannot become silent. And the voice of democracy ultimately reverberates throughout the country when parliamentary processes are on. I don't think that even in a lockdown, parliamentary processes should have been paralyzed. There's enough technology in place for us to have actually carried out a parliamentary session through video conferencing, because there were very important issues that needed to be discussed. And the most important issue, of course, was COVID-19 itself. How did we deal with it? Whether the decisions that we took were right or wrong, what we should do in the months to come. These are all aspects of COVID itself that we could have easily discussed, whether the protective kits were available to our health workers, to our doctors, whether there were enough facilities for intake of oxygen in the event of an emergency. There were enough medical facilities in place. That's, of course, one part of it, where the hospitals. Those who were left stranded and who walked hundreds and hundreds of kilometers to reach their homes, the migrant workers who lost their jobs, what kind of arrangements could have been made for them. All these issues had to be discussed. And in the context of the national, new education policy that has been announced, it's not been discussed in Parliament. So I think that the lockdown has in itself done great disservice to parliamentary processes, and the government, by not putting appropriate measures in place, has let us down in many ways. So that's one part of it. Then, of course, the fact of the matter is that when the executive took its decisions, it could not get appropriate feedback from people in the absence of connectivity. The reality is that our fiber optic network, which now is called BharatNet, originally it was the National Fiber Optic Network, NOFEN, as we called it. That project has also not yet been completed. I started that project way back when I was a minister, the NOFEN project. And we said that by 2020, we should have connected all the Gram Panchayats, 250,000 Gram Panchayats. And then with last mile connectivity, we should have connected with homes, laid fiber optic networks all through Wi-Fi, connected with schools, with hospitals, with other facilities available in districts. None of that has happened. In fact, as I talk, I think that, and I believe that about 90,000 Gram Panchayats have been actually connected with the network, but the last mile connectivity is missing. So in the context of COVID, there was no feedback that we were getting. The executive was not getting any feedback from the people because of lack of connectivity and because of lack of preparedness. And the same thing happened with the judiciary. The judiciary was completely unprepared, and even today is unprepared. It's true that we do have some cases that are being adjudicated upon and being heard, but that's not enough. And we shouldn't be looking at the Supreme Court of India alone on various high courts, where, of course, most of the regular cases are not being heard. And I don't think are likely to be heard in months to come. And that's, I think, doing great service to the people of this country, for those litigants who are waiting for justice and who are at the doorsteps of the court, can't even be heard. So obviously we were completely unprepared. And while we talk about high courts and Supreme Court, what about district courts, Mufassil courts? Where is the connectivity? Where is the video conferencing? Where are the judges, the district judges, the magistrates provided with these facilities? And while prisoners are in Tihar and other prisons around the country where COVID is spreading, what about their safety? What about their fundamental rights? The judiciary is completely unprepared, and it's impossible to get grievances heard in this situation. So the parliament, the executive, and the judiciary were completely unprepared to deal with this pandemic. And the reason was very simple, because there was no network in place. Recently, of course, as you know, what's happening in Rajasthan, I mean, governments are being toppled, and the voice of the people is not yet heard through parliament. So these are very serious issues, and we have to really think ahead as to what we should be doing and how do we reimagine policy in the context of the lockdown. And is video conferencing or connectivity the new normal? Apart from all this, we have the Disaster Management Act, as you know, of 2005. And under the provisions of that act, there is a National Disaster Management Authority, which is headed by the Prime Minister of India, along with 9 nominees. And in the event of a national disaster, there has to be a national plan in place. There has to be a state plan in place. There has to be a district plan in place. None of this happened. And as far as shelter homes are concerned, the Section 12 of the Act itself provides that the minimum standards for food, for sanitation, minimum standards for water, drinking water, for medical cover, all that had to be set by the National Disaster Management Authority, headed by the Prime Minister. None of that happened. None of that happened. Even though the national plan, the general plan, was put in place way back in 2008, and after that it was upgraded in 2016. But none of these minimum standards, which are mandatory under the Act, were put in place. And none of that was discussed anywhere. There had to be special provisions for widows and orphans, not put in place. There was ex gratia assistance on account of loss of life, on account of damage, and restoration of means of livelihood. Millions of people lost their livelihood. And the 20 lakh package is of no use to that loss of livelihood. That's the only a direction for the banks to lend more credit. Which MSME is interested in credit in the context of the fact that there is no business activity? So just the 20 lakh package was just a ruse, and none of this is discussed. None of this is in the public. Why? Because our video conferencing facilities are not in place. Our connectivity is not in place. And not only that, the Disaster Management Authority, headed by the Prime Minister, had to also work out other reliefs which were needed in the context of this pandemic. And one of the reliefs that's set out in Section 13 of the Act is that it says the national authority may, in cases of disaster of severe magnitude, recommend relief in repayment of loans or for grant of fresh loans to the persons affected by disaster on such concessional terms as may be appropriate. But the fact of the matter is that the National Disaster Management Authority has not even applied its mind. All this has been delegated to banks, to the Reserve Bank of India and to other banks and to state governments so that they can take decisions inconsistent with the Act. That's because if connectivity were in place, all of this would have actually worked out much better. So what do we have for the future? I think it's an opportunity. It's a great opportunity to ensure that this particular pandemic is converted into a call for us to put in place mechanisms that in the event of a disaster tomorrow of this nature, we could ensure that government processes don't come to a standstill. And therefore, I believe that policy making and legal maneuvering must ensure that the new India must have the capacity to deal with pandemics of this nature. It is that new India that we need to build. Thank you.
Now, you have been in the past the Minister for Law and Justice and the Minister for Communications, apart from being the Minister for Science and Technology and also for Human Resource Development. Now, you say that 90,000 panchayats, to your knowledge, are connected by Wi-Fi now, which means a larger number of district headquarters must be well connected. What prevents our district courts from functioning the way some high courts and the Supreme Court have been functioning over video conference?
Well, I don't think they have the facilities, and I don't think that the lawyers in the district court are knowledgeable about these issues. And quite apart from the fact that the fiber optic network may be in place in 90,000 Gram panchayats, where is the Wi-Fi facility? Sometimes there's no electricity.
Yeah.
And remember, when you talk about delivering justice, individuals have to meet the lawyer. See, we in the Supreme Court argue on the basis of a brief. But in the district court, the client has to meet the lawyer.
Right.
And the client doesn't have the facility of video conferencing to talk to the lawyer from a distance. So how will the system work, even if you have the fiber optic network in place?
Yeah.
Because you have to build a case. If it's a criminal case, you have to build a case. And you build a case by talking to the client, because it's not like the High Court and the Supreme Court that is an appeal and you have an appeal paper book, and on the basis of that paper you argue a case. That doesn't happen, because even in a civil dispute or in a criminal action by the state, the client has to brief his lawyer. That's not possible under the present circumstance, because many clients will not have those facilities at all.
So today we have fairly ubiquitous telephone connectivity, thanks to the telecom revolution that actually took place over 2005 to 2012-13. Even in rural areas, telecom penetration is very high. And the number of smartphones today is over 40 crore. So I'm sure if you put your phone, activate the Wi-Fi hotspot on your phone, it is possible for people to do rudimentary video conferencing. I think the will is missing more than the physical capacity.
TK, I don't agree with you. I'll tell you, look, I've been telecom minister. I can manage computers and I can manage connectivity, but I find it very difficult myself, because if you send me an email, and say do video conferencing, to translate that onto my computer, very few people know how to do it.
Okay.
You must understand that you have to have rudimentary, not just knowledge, but the facility, right? And you should have, each individual lawyer should have the ability to use that facility. And most people are completely inexperienced at that. Yeah. Even people who are somewhat familiar with these gadgets.
So we are talking about the law in times of the pandemic. Would you say the Disaster Management Act never foresaw a possibility of the country being shut down, of all its institutions stopping working for such an extended period of time? Do you think the law was deficient in not foreseeing this possibility and requiring Parliament to meet, for courts to function, for other institutions of the government to function, so that people have minimum recourse to get justice and redress?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I don't think the law was in place. I don't think the technology was in place. I don't think the minds were in place. After all, you must have the mindset of actually, foreseeing that in the event of a disaster, what will happen. I mean, for example, you imagine what happened in Uttarakhand and the kind of natural disaster that took place. And who helped us ultimately? The mobile phone.
Right.
It is the mobile phone that allowed us to actually track people, right?
Yeah.
Now that a mobile phone can be easily used, and it's simple, anybody can use a mobile phone. But video conferencing is a far more difficult thing to do. Even judges sitting in the Supreme Court do not agree. It's the staff that helps them connect to us. Yes. And it's some of my juniors are far more efficient in using these techniques that help me connect with the judges.
Right.
And you can imagine how difficult it will be for ordinary people. So I think that we have failed as a nation. As a nation, we should have actually... See, it's like this. Connectivity, technology are fundamentals in the functioning of the world in the 21st century.
Right.
They are fundamentals. If you ask me, in education, illiteracy is more important than literacy alone.
Right.
In fact, the definition of literacy must include illiteracy. And if you remember, I was the only one who talked about the Akash tablet when I was HRD minister.
Right.
And this is what I said. Because in India, for example, there are no teachers. Sometimes you have classes with 90:1, a ratio of 90 students to 1 teacher. With the Right to Education Act sort of says it should be between 20 and 30. Now, had we carried it through in 2009, we are 11 years down the road. Had we carried that through, things would have been in place. But the policymakers didn't have that mindset to carry it through. Mere sloganeering will not do. And I said that the entire network should be put in place by 2020. These are my public statements made at that time. Where in 2020, none of this has happened. This is not the only thing. There has to be course material. Remember, you may have a network, but without content, what will flow in that network? Nothing. So you need simultaneously to build content for education or for other services, for medical facilities. That content also is not available. So nobody ever thought of this.
Let me raise a slightly different subject. Supposing we do make it a practice to let courts function through video conferencing at a broader level. It will spread from high courts to district courts, perhaps later to municipal courts. Would this encourage the videography of court proceedings? I'm asking this specifically in the context of a recent newspaper report about a gang rape victim in Araria being sent to jail because she asked the magistrate to be allowed to read the statement she was being asked to sign. She said, "I do not know how to read. Will you please help me understand what I am signing by allowing these 2 friends of mine who are present to read the statement?" The magistrate took umbrage at her effrontery and sent her to jail and sent those 2 friends also to jail. Now, had this been videographed, or the judge knew that this is going to be, magistrate knew this is going to be videographed, this would not happen. There is miscarriage of justice, court proceedings not being conducted the way it should be conducted. There has been a suggestion that hearings, court proceedings should be videographed. Do you think this would be a possibility?
Okay, there are two aspects to this. Number one, I am the one who talked about it as minister. I said court proceedings must be recorded. And I said that in the context of the kind of illegalities that are committed during the course of those proceedings, right? Illegality is committed by the judge, by the lawyers of procedure. Sometimes three matters are being taken up at the same time. One evidence has been recorded at one end of the table, the other case evidence is recorded at the other end of the table, and the judge is hearing a third case. Right? Now, but that is for the purposes of record,
right,
not for the purposes of showing it to the public.
Okay.
Okay? In other words, if I challenge the proceedings and those are already video recorded, it will not then depend on affidavits being filed by parties trying to ascertain what the truth is, because the truth will be revealed by accessing the video recording. So while I fully support video recording, I do not support public viewing of these things, because then what will happen is that it will become a tamasha in court, right? Each lawyer would like to impress people outside the courtroom,
Right. Yeah.
but for reasons which are entirely divorced from a sensible legal argument. So yes, I think trial court, especially district courts, trial courts proceedings should be recorded only for the purposes of ascertaining that all went well. High Court, some matters may be shown to the public, but there is a danger to that. And I'll tell you something very interesting. In the United States today, in the US Supreme Court, no proceeding is ever shown to the public, but audio recordings are actually put on the networks for people to listen to what the arguments were.
Okay.
Right? So that there is no sort of pandering to public sentiment while the matter is going on.
Okay.
In the High Court, in the courts in England, for example, today, each judge decides which matters he will hear in court, even in the midst of the pandemic. So it has been left to the judge to decide which matters he'll hear physically. And I think that should be decided here as well. So I don't think that video proceedings for all court matters is a sensible thing. I don't think it's sensible at all. Yes, in certain kinds of matters, it's possible. Like, for example, in trial courts now, the accused do not have to come to court every 14 days. It's done through video recording. So some procedural issues, some small matters, some urgent matters can be done through video recording, right? But I don't think as a matter of law, everything should be through video conferencing.
Since you are talking of using technology in the courtroom for the functioning of law, is it possible to think of a situation where a case can be conceptually broken down into the legal principle, the evidence which warrants the application of the legal principle, and the arguments for it, so that precedents set by the Supreme Court on how these legal principles can be applied are automatically available to the judges, to the lawyers, and so there is no errant judgments which go violate the legal principles and their application in the present case, given a certain precedent. Now, you take the case of sedition. You will find every Mufazzal court is now happily slapping sedition charges on people on grounds that are completely invalidated by the Supreme Court on where sedition subsists. Now, if you could actually strike an alarm whenever such a thing is, such a judgment is passed, because it violates the Supreme Court warning. Suppose this could be monitored by a Supreme Court registry. It could automatically be annulled. Do you think some such thing is possible?
See, we don't have faith in human beings. How will we have faith in technology? If human beings want to violate the law, they will violate the law. I've seen that happen far too often. And recently, by the Rajasthan High Court itself, when a judgment by 5 judges of the Supreme Court in Kyoto Holohan says that you cannot interfere in proceedings before the speaker takes a decision, and the High Court brazenly, without reason, disregards it. What do you say to that? And how will technology help? And how will those principles help? Ultimately, I agree with you that in fact, technology should be used, can be used, must be used for evolving those principles. But those who violate, those sitting there who will violate those principles will violate those principles.
So what is the remedy?
The remedy is to make sure that judges themselves follow the law. I'm sorry to say that publicly. Unfortunately. Look at sedition. I mean, the way this is being misused in India. I mean, can an individual in this country wage a war against the state? You can't.
Yeah.
The state is far too powerful to say that young students in JNU or others were waging a war against India and use sedition against them. It's unheard of. And this is against principles laid down by Supreme Court and judgments of the Supreme Court. That waging a war requires some, not only a meeting of minds, but act, not just by words, by actual acts of sedition. I mean, we're not in the British Raj that people used to be sent to jail for sedition under 124A, and the judges used to pass those lawless orders. If the same thing is happening here, then it's a very sorry tale for democracy.
It's a sorry state for the Supreme Court. The court's verdict is being shouted by the lowest court possible, time and again.
How will technology help is the answer to your question.
So
in any case, this is known. The High Court knows that there is a judgment. The High Court refers to that judgment and yet chooses not to follow it. So when you know that there is a judgment and yet you don't follow it, how will technology help? That's the question.
So coming to Parliament, the British Parliament has started sitting. Some members are taking part physically, some members taking part by video link. Why is it not possible for Indian Parliament also to meet?
Yes, it is possible, but they don't want to do it because they don't want questions to be asked in Parliament that may make them look bad. So obviously, they're purposely not holding Parliament. What's the problem in holding Parliament? So there can be social distancing. Each party can nominate X number of people who can go to Rajya Sabha or Lok Sabha, as the case may be, and the balance can be connected through video conferencing, and they can make their contributions in that process. But this government doesn't want uncomfortable questions to be asked. That's about it.
So is there anything in the law which prevents this?
No. Why should it prevent it? See, remember, the House is a master of its proceedings. The House itself. And the House means the majority of the House.
Right.
In this particular case, it means governments.
Right.
Government represented by the BJP in Parliament. They are the majority, right? So if the House decides that we will have this process, nobody can challenge it because the House itself is master of its proceedings.
Yeah.
So there's nothing to prevent it.
So on the new education policy, let me ask you something. What is the status of policy vis-a-vis law? Now, the new education policy says education should be a public service or a private philanthropic activity. It wants to regulate fees. It is generally against for-profit education. Now, many institutions in this country, education institutions offer education as a service for which people pay, and whether you formally accept it as a for-profit educational enterprise or not, it is actually for-profit. Now, if the new policy is enforced in a way that violates the ability of these institutions to work as they have been working, what is the legal status of those institutions and the attempt to make them give financial assistance to private students, to make them subsidize the education of students when they are not in a position to, because they don't get any money from the government for this?
Well, there's a problem because, we have Supreme Court judgments to the effect that any amount of money that you make, any surplus that you have in the context of fees and whatever is earned by the institution has to be plowed back into the institution. That's the law of the country. You can't violate that law.
Right.
But quite frankly, you look at any business enterprise, the interest of that enterprise is always to plow back money into the system because that's how the business activity is expanded and that's how there is more possibility of making more money, right? If you siphon off that money, then it's not in the interest of that activity at all because the whole purpose and objective of any business or any enterprise is to expand its footprint. Right? So if you allow freedom to educational institutions, you do that, you will be able to achieve both things. Expanding activity would mean also that those very managements will help the marginalized community much more than they would otherwise do, quite frankly. Yeah. So this whole regulation also is counterproductive.
No, right? What is the legal status of the policy? Can it be challenged in the court?
It's only a policy. A policy can never be challenged in court. Okay. It's when that policy is translated into regulations and law that it can be challenged.
Now, a cursory reading of the policy brought out one aspect which to me looks very dangerous. It says every higher education institution will be governed by a governing body. The governing body will renew itself by appointing fresh members. which means the initial governing body will decide the nature and composition of the governing body in perpetuity. It will never be changed. Suppose a group of religious fundamentalists, those will be the earth was flat, or that the world was created in 7 days. If those people form the governing body, and they have the right to appoint fresh members of the governing body, and those who become the subsequent governing body appoint the next governing body. So in perpetuity, you have one set of philosophies or one set of guiding principles controlling the functioning of higher education. Now, to my mind, this seems a very dangerous kind of institutional framework. Now, can this be challenged in law?
I think it can. I think that, again, this impacts freedom.
Right.
It impacts freedom of see, regulation must serve a public purpose, right? Today, education is perceived to be an occupation, not a business.
Right.
That's what the Supreme Court says, right? Now you can regulate that occupation in the larger public interest. What's the public interest in this? In fact, you're not allowing the governing body to achieve its objectives, because each governing body will have a different objective. If you ask me, that it's the mushrooming of excellence in the context of diversity of objectives in education that will really bring about the kind of institutions that we want. And that can only happen if you allow freedom to the governing body to function in the manner that it wishes to function. It should not be subjected to any kind of policy prescription.
Now, the governing body of Harvard, for example, Harvard is a dual governing body structure.
Yes.
To one body, graduates of Harvard elect people.
Yes.
It's not that governing body can propagate itself by appointing fresh members.
That's correct.
So there is a fertilization of new ideas coming in.
Absolutely.
That is completely foreclosed in the institutional.
I agree. But first of all, you can challenge it. But of course, you should have mindsets of judges also sitting in court who see, the benefit of. See, we have never built global institutions. We have never even attempted to build global institutions because we have never allowed the foundation and the freedom required to set up those institutions through government processes. I mean, even the IITs. The government thinks that by giving money, it is doing a favor to institutions. The fact of the matter is that it's the obligation of government to give money to institutions. It's a legal obligation because no institution by itself, the kind of $250 billion that are spent in R&D in universities in the United States, those $250 billion are given by government for the purposes of research and other things. They don't in any way impact the freedom of those institutions because they believe that by actually investing in these institutions, you will have new ideas, which in turn will be foundations for wealth creation. But this kind of mindset is absent in India, unfortunately.
I think this current discussion probably we'll have to conclude now because we are sort of short past the time. But we would like to have you later discussing some other subjects if you would be free to spare the time.
I'll be more than happy. But thank you very much, TK.
Thank you. Yeah.
It's really lovely talking to you.
Yeah, thank you.
All the best.
Well, that brings day one of the summit to a close. I'd like to thank our stellar lineup of speakers for sharing their incredibly valuable insights. But I'd especially like to thank all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for being such an incredible audience. We'll be back tomorrow with more movers and shakers from across industry who are shaping global thinking and the domestic economy in the process. Big thanks to our partners, of course, for collaborating with us and making our vision a reality.
Presenting partner, vConfex. Powered by IBF, ICFAI Business School. Digital transformation partner, IBM. Associate partner, Mahindra World City. Global speaking partner, London Speaker Bureau. Training and workshop partner, ET Masterclass. Telecast partner, ET Now.
Have a lovely evening and do maintain social distancing norms and take all the government-sanctioned precautionary measures to stay safe. We wish you all the best and stay healthy. Thank you.